In 1855, the territory of New Mexico was a harsh and unforgiving frontier, where survival depended on trust, and trust was a commodity more precious than gold. The town of San Rafael del Valle existed as little more than a collection of adobe buildings scattered across the high desert, connected by dusty paths that disappeared into endless horizons. Here, among the sagebrush and red rock formations, lived people who understood that in such isolation, a man's word was often all he had to offer. The Spanish settlers, who had established this remote outpost generations earlier, brought with them not only their customs and faith, but also their stories, tales of divine justice and supernatural intervention that would soon prove more relevant than anyone could imagine. Subscribe now to uncover the chilling truth behind one of the American West's most documented supernatural phenomena. Life in San Rafael del Valle moved at the rhythm of church bells, which called the faithful to morning mass, marked the passing of each hour, and tolled solemnly for the departed. These bronze sentinels, cast in Mexico City and transported across hundreds of miles of treacherous terrain, had watched over the community for nearly a century. Father Miguel Santana, the village priest, maintained these bells with the devotion of a man who understood their significance beyond mere timekeeping. Each morning he would climb the worn wooden steps to the bell tower, checking the ropes and examining the bronze surfaces for signs of wear or damage. The bells had never failed in their duty, ringing clear and true across the valley, their voices carrying messages of hope, celebration, and sorrow to every corner of the small community. The first strange occurrence happened on a Tuesday morning in March, when merchant Diego Herrera stood before the town council, claiming his missing cattle had been stolen by Apache raiders. As he spoke, his voice growing louder with each accusation, the church bells suddenly began to ring, not the measured tolling of the hour, but a frantic, almost angry clanging that seemed to come from nowhere. Father Santana, who had been tending his garden behind the church, rushed to investigate, finding the bell ropes hanging motionless and undisturbed. More troubling still, when he climbed to the tower, he discovered that the bells themselves showed no sign of recent movement. The bronze surfaces were cold to the touch, without the vibrations that would naturally follow such violent ringing. Meanwhile, in the town square, Diego Herrera had fallen silent, his face pale as desert bone. The council members exchanged worried glances, for they knew what the merchant apparently did not want to admit. His cattle had not been taken by raiders, but had been sold secretly in Santa Fe to pay gambling debts. The bells, it seemed, had announced what everyone suspected, but no one dared to voice. This incident would have been dismissed as mere coincidence, if not for what happened next. Within a week, the phenomenon repeated itself with disturbing consistency. Maria Guadalupe Vasquez, a respected widow who ran the general store, stood accused by her neighbor of stealing a silver cross from his deceased wife's grave. As she protested her innocence before Father Santana and several witnesses, the bells erupted into a cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. This time, 3 people ran to check the bell tower simultaneously: the priest, the blacksmith, and a young boy who happened to be playing nearby. All 3 confirmed the impossible. The bells were ringing with tremendous force, yet no human hand was pulling the ropes, and no wind or earthquake could account for the movement. More unsettling was the pattern of the ringing itself. Unlike the random clanging that had accompanied Diego's false accusation, Maria's protest was met with a measured, almost musical tolling that seemed to speak of truth and vindication. Later that same day, her accuser's own son confessed to taking the cross, hoping to sell it to buy medicine for his sick wife. The contrast between the 2 incidents created an unavoidable conclusion that chilled the residents to their core. The bells were not simply ringing at random moments of tension, but were responding specifically to the presence of lies and truth. Word of the supernatural bells spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by traders, travelers, and the network of communication that connected even the most remote settlements. Within a month, San Rafael del Valle found itself hosting an unusual collection of visitors. Territorial officials investigating reports of the phenomenon, Catholic Church authorities seeking to understand possible divine intervention, and curious settlers from neighboring communities who had heard impossible stories and needed to witness the truth for themselves. Father Santana, a learned man who had studied theology in Mexico City, found himself grappling with questions that challenged everything he thought he understood about faith and the supernatural. He spent long nights in prayer and study, searching through religious texts for precedent or explanation. The concept of divine objects responding to human deception was not unknown in Catholic tradition. There were stories of crucifixes bleeding when confronted with great sins and statues weeping in the presence of suffering. But bells that could detect lies with such precision suggested something beyond traditional miracles. The phenomenon was becoming less a curiosity and more a force that was reshaping the very social fabric of the community, as people began to realize that their small desert town might be home to a form of supernatural justice. The bells' supernatural abilities created an atmosphere of profound unease throughout the territory, as news of their power reached officials in Santa Fe and beyond. Territorial Judge William Morrison, a pragmatic man who had spent years dealing with disputes in frontier communities, arrived in San Rafael del Valle with considerable skepticism and a determination to expose what he assumed was an elaborate hoax. He had seen enough false prophets and staged miracles in his career to recognize the signs of deliberate deception. Morrison's investigation began with a thorough examination of the church structure, the bells themselves, and interviews with every person who claimed to have witnessed the phenomenon. He brought with him a surveyor, an engineer, and even a self-proclaimed expert in mechanical devices who examined every inch of the bell tower, looking for hidden mechanisms, concealed wires, or any other explanation for the mysterious ringing. For 3 days, they found nothing that could account for the reports they had heard. The bells were exactly what they appeared to be, century-old bronze artifacts with no hidden modifications or unusual characteristics. The ropes showed normal wear patterns, and the tower's construction revealed no secret passages or concealed chambers where a conspirator might hide. Yet Morrison's presence in the town would soon provide the most dramatic demonstration of the bell's power that anyone had yet witnessed. Judge Morrison's test of the bells came on a Friday afternoon when he gathered the entire community in the town square and announced his intention to conduct an experiment. He had prepared a series of statements, some true, some false, which he would speak aloud to determine whether the phenomenon was real or imagined. The crowd gathered in tense silence as Morrison began with simple, verifiable facts: his name, his position, the date of his arrival in town. The bells remained silent. He then stated that he had been born in Virginia, that he had served in the Mexican-American War, and that he was married to a woman named Catherine. Again, no response from the tower. The tension in the crowd was palpable as Morrison's voice grew more confident. Then, looking directly at Father Santana, he declared that he had come to San Rafael del Valle with no preconceptions and was conducting an entirely objective investigation. The moment the words left his lips, the bells exploded into a violent clanging that seemed to make the ground shake beneath the gathered crowd. Morrison's face went white as the ringing continued for nearly a full minute, longer than any previous episode. When silence finally returned, the judge stood frozen, unable to deny what everyone present had witnessed. Later, in the privacy of the priest's quarters, Morrison admitted that he had indeed come to town determined to debunk what he considered dangerous superstition, regardless of the evidence he might find. The psychological impact of living under constant supernatural surveillance began to transform San Rafael del Valle in ways both profound and disturbing. Residents found themselves measuring every word before speaking, creating an atmosphere of tension that permeated even the most casual conversations. Children learned to tell the truth not from moral instruction, but from fear of triggering the bell's wrath. Marriages strained under the weight of absolute honesty, as couples discovered that some social lubricating lies, compliments about appearance, reassurances about financial worries, or polite agreements about trivial matters, were no longer possible without supernatural consequence. The general store became a place of whispered transactions, as customers could no longer exaggerate their poverty to negotiate better prices, or merchants claim false scarcity to justify higher costs. Even Father Santana found his pastoral duties complicated by the phenomenon. Confession, traditionally a private matter between penitent and priest, became fraught with anxiety as people worried whether incomplete or dishonest admissions might trigger the bell's response, even within the supposed sanctuary of the confessional. The social fabric of the community, once held together by the comfortable flexibility that small lies and omissions provided, was being rewoven into something harder and more brittle. Like explorers venturing into uncharted territory, don't forget to subscribe as we navigate deeper into this supernatural mystery that challenged everything the frontier settlers thought they knew about truth, community, and divine justice. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a physician and amateur scientist from Boston, arrived in San Rafael del Valle in late April with a collection of equipment that fascinated the local population. Barometric instruments, a seismograph, and various devices designed to measure vibrations, temperature changes, and atmospheric disturbances. Unlike Judge Morrison, who had approached the phenomenon with legal skepticism, Hartwell brought scientific curiosity and genuine excitement about the possibility of documenting supernatural activity through empirical observation. He established his base of operations in a room adjacent to the church, where he could monitor his instruments while maintaining visual contact with the bell tower. For the first week, his measurements revealed nothing unusual. Atmospheric pressure remained stable, ground vibrations stayed within normal ranges for a desert environment, and temperature fluctuations followed predictable daily patterns. Hartwell began to wonder if his presence had somehow disrupted the phenomenon, as no episodes occurred during his initial observation period. The doctor's scientific background included extensive study of acoustics and mechanical engineering, knowledge that made the reports of self-ringing bells even more intriguing. He understood the physics involved in bell operation and knew that the forces required to produce the violent ringing described by witnesses would leave unmistakable evidence in the form of rope wear, metal stress, and structural vibration. Yet his careful examination confirmed what previous investigators had found: no physical evidence of the mechanisms that would be necessary to create such effects through conventional means. Hartwell's opportunity to document the phenomenon came when merchant Samuel Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had established a successful trading business between Santa Fe and El Paso, arrived in town carrying news of Apache activity in the region. Chen's presence was significant because he represented the growing diversity of the American frontier, where people of many backgrounds came together in pursuit of opportunity and survival. When Chen reported to the local authorities that his wagon train had encountered no hostile activity during their recent journey, contradicting widespread rumors of increased Apache raids, his statement was met with relief, but also suspicion. Some residents wondered if Chen might be downplaying the dangers to protect his business interests. As Chen repeated his account to a gathering that included Hartwell, Father Santana, and several town leaders, the doctor's instruments began registering anomalous readings. The barometric pressure showed sudden fluctuations, despite clear skies. The seismograph detected rhythmic vibrations that had no apparent source, and the temperature in the church dropped by several degrees in a matter of minutes. Then the bells began to ring, not with the violent clanging that accompanied outright lies, but with a strange, harmonious pattern that seemed almost approving. Hartwell's measurements during this episode would provide the first scientific documentation of physical changes accompanying the supernatural phenomena. Readings that defied conventional explanation, but offered tantalizing clues about the nature of whatever force was at work in the desert community. The scientific data collected by Dr. Hartwell revealed patterns that were both fascinating and disturbing in their implications. His instruments consistently detected electromagnetic anomalies during Bell episodes, with compass needles spinning wildly and metallic objects throughout the church exhibiting temporary magnetic properties. Temperature readings showed not just the initial drop he had first observed, but complex fluctuations that seemed to correlate with the emotional intensity of the lies being told. Small deceptions produced minor environmental changes, while significant falsehoods created dramatic atmospheric disturbances that his instruments could barely measure. Most intriguingly, Hartwell discovered that the phenomenon had a cumulative effect. Repeated lies by the same individual produced increasingly severe responses, as if whatever force controlled the bells was learning to recognize and judge specific people. His detailed notes documented 17 separate episodes over 3 weeks, each accompanied by measurable physical phenomena that ruled out coincidence or mass hallucination. The doctor's scientific background made him particularly troubled by one aspect of his data. The electromagnetic disturbances appeared to begin several seconds before the lies were actually spoken, suggesting that the phenomenon responded to intent rather than just words. This discovery implied a level of supernatural awareness that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, truth, and divine justice. Hartwell's reports, sent to colleagues in Boston and published in obscure scientific journals, would later influence paranormal researchers and contribute to the growing field of psychical research in the late 19th century. As spring turned to summer, the bells of San Rafael del Valle began to affect more than just the local community. Their influence spread throughout the territory as stories of supernatural justice attracted people from all walks of life. Circuit judges began scheduling stops in the town specifically to observe the phenomenon, hoping to understand whether divine intervention might have practical applications in frontier justice. Lawyers traveling between Santa Fe and El Paso would make detours to witness the bells in action, and some began bringing difficult cases to the community, hoping that supernatural lie detection might resolve disputes that conventional legal processes could not handle. The town found itself becoming an unlikely center of legal innovation, where truth was determined not by testimony or evidence, but by the mysterious judgment of bronze bells that had somehow become vessels of divine authority. Father Santana struggled with the theological implications of this development, recognizing that his small parish was effectively challenging the established systems of both secular and religious justice. The Catholic Church's official position on supernatural phenomena required careful investigation and validation through established ecclesiastical procedures. But the bishops in Santa Fe were reluctant to either endorse or condemn something that appeared to promote truthfulness and moral behavior. Meanwhile, territorial officials found themselves in the awkward position of relying on supernatural intervention to resolve legal disputes, creating precedents that would have seemed impossible in more established regions of the country where traditional institutions maintained stronger authority. The most dramatic legal case to come before the bells involved the murder trial of Thomas Brennan, an Irish prospector accused of killing his partner over disputed mining claims. The case had been transferred to San Rafael del Valle specifically because conventional evidence was insufficient for conviction, yet witnesses and circumstantial facts strongly suggested Brennan's guilt. Judge Morrison, who had returned to observe this unprecedented application of supernatural justice to serious criminal proceedings, presided over a trial that would have been impossible anywhere else in the American legal system. Brennan's defense was simple. He would tell his story truthfully and let the bells judge his innocence or guilt. The defendant stood in the church, surrounded by a crowd that included legal officials, newspaper correspondents, and residents from across the territory. His account was detailed and consistent. He claimed that his partner had been killed by claim jumpers while Brennan was away gathering supplies, and that he had returned to find the body and evidence of a struggle. As he spoke, Dr. Hartwell's instruments detected minor electromagnetic fluctuations, but the bells remained silent. The crowd held its breath as Brennan concluded his testimony with a direct statement of innocence. He had not killed his partner, had not conspired with others to commit the murder, and had reported the crime honestly to territorial authorities. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, broken only by the desert wind whistling through the church windows. The bells' silence was as powerful as their ringing would have been, providing a form of vindication that no conventional trial could have offered. The acquittal of Thomas Brennan through supernatural intervention rather than conventional legal processes created ripple effects throughout the territorial justice system and raised questions that extended far beyond the borders of New Mexico. Newspaper accounts of the trial reached newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, and even as far east as New York, where readers struggled to comprehend reports of murder cases being resolved by bronze bells that could detect lies. Legal scholars debated whether such supernatural intervention could or should be considered valid evidence in criminal proceedings, while religious leaders argued about the theological implications of divine judgment manifesting through material objects. The frontier, with its tradition of rough justice and practical solutions to survival challenges, proved more accepting of unconventional approaches to truth and justice than the established eastern states, where legal institutions had deeper roots and stronger resistance to innovation. Some critics argued that relying on supernatural phenomena for criminal justice represented a dangerous regression to medieval superstition, while supporters pointed out that the bells had proven more reliable than human testimony or conventional evidence. The debate revealed fundamental tensions in American society about the role of religion, the nature of justice, and the relationship between traditional institutions and frontier pragmatism. Meanwhile, in San Rafael del Valle, the residents continued to live under the constant supervision of their supernatural guardians, adapting to a reality where truth was not just a moral ideal, but an enforced requirement for peaceful community life. Keep following this incredible journey by subscribing, because the story of the supernatural bells was about to take an even more mysterious turn. Father Santana's attempts to understand the theological significance of the bells led him to research similar phenomena in Catholic history and folklore, uncovering accounts of supernatural objects that responded to human behavior dating back to medieval Europe. His correspondence with church scholars in Mexico City and Rome revealed a rich tradition of miraculous artifacts, statues that wept, crucifixes that bled, and bells that rang to warn of approaching danger or divine displeasure. However, none of these historical accounts described objects with the specific ability to detect and respond to lies with the consistency demonstrated by the San Rafael del Valle bells. The priest's investigation took on new urgency when he discovered records suggesting that the bells themselves had an unusual history. According to documents he found in the church archives, the bells had been cast not for San Rafael del Valle, but for a cathedral in Guadalajara that had never been completed due to a scandal involving corruption and deceit among church officials. The bells had been stored for decades before being sold to fund other projects, eventually making their way to the frontier community through a series of transactions that the records did not fully explain. This discovery raised disturbing questions about whether the bells had somehow absorbed supernatural properties through their association with lies and corruption, or whether they had been created with inherent abilities that only manifested under specific conditions. Father Santana's research also revealed accounts of similar phenomena in indigenous folklore, suggesting that the location itself might have spiritual significance that predated European settlement. The indigenous history of the area around San Rafael del Valle provided another layer of mystery to the supernatural phenomena. Father Santana's conversations with elderly Pueblo residents revealed oral traditions describing the site as a place where the spirit world intersected with the physical realm, a location where truth and falsehood could not coexist without consequences. These stories, passed down through generations, spoke of ancient ceremonies performed to maintain balance between honesty and deception, rituals that had been disrupted by European colonization, but whose effects might still influence the area. The Pueblo elders were not surprised by reports of the bell's behavior. They understood it as a manifestation of older spiritual forces that had found new expression through Catholic artifacts. This perspective offered a different framework for understanding the phenomenon, one that emphasized spiritual ecology rather than divine intervention, suggesting that the bells were not acting independently, but were channeling environmental spiritual energy that had always existed in the location. The indigenous interpretation also provided practical insights about managing the supernatural effects. Traditional stories included accounts of how communities had learned to live with similar phenomena, developing social practices and spiritual disciplines that allowed people to coexist with supernatural oversight while maintaining healthy relationships and community cohesion. These ancient wisdom traditions offered potential solutions to the psychological stress that San Rafael del Valle residents were experiencing as they adapted to life under constant supernatural surveillance. Dr. Hartwell's continued scientific investigation revealed that the electromagnetic anomalies associated with the bells were becoming stronger and more complex over time, as if the phenomenon was developing increased sensitivity and sophistication. His instruments detected patterns, suggesting that the force controlling the bells was learning to distinguish not just between truth and falsehood, but between different types and degrees of deception. White lies told to spare someone's feelings produced different responses than deliberate falsehoods intended to deceive for personal gain, while lies told under duress or fear showed yet another pattern of supernatural reaction. This growing complexity created new challenges for the community, as residents found it increasingly difficult to predict when their words might trigger supernatural intervention. The bells began responding to implications and half-truths that technically contained no outright falsehoods, suggesting that whatever intelligence controlled them was developing a nuanced understanding of human communication and motivation. Hartwell's data also indicated that the phenomenon was expanding beyond the immediate vicinity of the church. His instruments detected similar electromagnetic signatures at increasing distances from the bell tower, implying that the supernatural influence was gradually extending throughout the valley. This expansion raised the possibility that the entire region might eventually fall under supernatural oversight, creating a zone where conventional forms of social interaction would become impossible. The implications for territorial development, legal proceedings, and normal community life were staggering, suggesting that San Rafael del Valle might be evolving into something unprecedented in human history, a place where supernatural justice had completely replaced human institutions. The expanding influence of the supernatural bells created unexpected consequences for trade and commerce throughout the region. Merchants who had initially been curious about the phenomenon began avoiding San Rafael del Valle as they discovered that their normal business practices, exaggerating product quality, concealing defects, negotiating through strategic misinformation, were impossible under supernatural oversight. The local economy began to suffer as trade routes shifted to bypass the community, and residents found themselves increasingly isolated from regional commerce and communication networks. Samuel Chen, the Chinese merchant who had experienced the bell's approval for his truthful reporting, became one of the few traders willing to continue doing business in the town. But even he struggled with the supernatural constraints on normal commercial interaction. The economic impact forced residents to develop new forms of trade and exchange based on complete transparency and honesty, creating what Dr. Hartwell described as a fascinating experiment in supernatural economics. Prices became fixed based on actual value rather than negotiation. Product quality was described with absolute accuracy, and business relationships developed a level of trust that was impossible to maintain in conventional commercial environments. However, this economic transformation also highlighted the ways in which small deceptions and flexible interpretations of truth served important social functions in normal communities. The rigid honesty enforced by the bells eliminated not just harmful fraud, but also the minor exaggerations and optimistic projections that helped people cope with uncertainty and maintain hope during difficult times. As summer progressed, the psychological pressure of living under constant supernatural surveillance began to manifest in unexpected ways throughout the community. Some residents developed what Dr. Hartwell termed pathological honesty, a compulsive need to confess every minor transgression, doubtful thought, or impure motivation, even when no one had asked for such revelations. Others retreated into near-complete silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and then only in the most carefully measured terms possible. Children, who had initially adapted to the phenomenon with remarkable flexibility, began showing signs of stress as they struggled to understand adult concepts of truth, deception, and moral complexity while living in an environment where supernatural forces enforced absolute honesty. Father Santana found himself counseling an increasing number of parishioners who were experiencing spiritual crises related to the bell's influence. Some questioned whether they had any free will remaining if their every word was subject to supernatural judgment, while others wondered whether the community was experiencing divine blessing or divine punishment. The priest's own faith was challenged as he grappled with theological questions about the relationship between truth, justice, and human nature. His prayers for guidance seemed to go unanswered, and he began to wonder whether the supernatural phenomena represented God's intervention or something more ambiguous and potentially dangerous. The community that had initially welcomed the bells as agents of justice was beginning to understand that absolute truth could be as destructive as absolute falsehood, and that human society required a certain amount of flexibility and ambiguity to function effectively. The first serious attempt to silence the bells came in August, when a group of residents led by merchant Diego Herrera, whose false accusation had triggered the original manifestation, decided that the supernatural oversight had become unbearable. Their plan was simple: remove the bells from the tower and bury them far from the community, hoping to break whatever spiritual connection enabled their supernatural behavior. The attempt began at midnight, when the conspirators believed they could work undetected, but their plan was complicated by the fact that every stage of the operation required lies or deceptions that immediately triggered supernatural response. When they claimed to be conducting routine maintenance, the bells rang in protest. When they insisted they were acting for the good of the community, the ringing became violent enough to wake residents throughout the town. Most disturbing of all, when Diego privately assured his fellow conspirators that removing the bells would solve all their problems, the bronze artifacts began ringing with a pattern that sounded almost like laughter, mocking, sardonic, and deeply unsettling. The failed attempt to silence the bells had consequences that extended beyond mere failure. In the days that followed, the supernatural responses became more intense and immediate, as if the bells had interpreted the removal attempt as a challenge to their authority. Minor deceptions that had previously been ignored now triggered immediate responses, and the electromagnetic anomalies detected by Dr. Hartwell's instruments reached levels that caused his equipment to malfunction. The community realized that they were no longer dealing with a benign, supernatural phenomenon that encouraged honesty, but with a force that would actively resist attempts to escape its influence. The escalating supernatural activity attracted the attention of church authorities in Santa Fe, who dispatched Father Antonio Valdez, an experienced investigator of alleged miracles and supernatural phenomena. Father Valdez arrived in September with explicit instructions to determine whether the bells represented genuine divine intervention, demonic influence, or elaborate fraud, and to recommend appropriate ecclesiastical action based on his findings. His investigation methodology was more rigorous than any previous examination, including extensive interviews with witnesses, careful documentation of supernatural episodes, and theological analysis of the phenomenon's consistency with Catholic doctrine about divine intervention and supernatural manifestations. Father Valdez's presence created additional tension within the community, as residents realized that his conclusions could result in official church condemnation of the bells, potentially branding their town as a site of heretical or demonic activity. The investigators' scholarly approach revealed aspects of the phenomenon that previous observers had missed. He discovered that the bells' responses showed theological sophistication that suggested familiarity with complex moral reasoning and church teaching about the nature of truth, deception, and moral responsibility. This discovery was particularly significant because it indicated that the supernatural intelligence controlling the bells understood not just the factual content of statements, but their moral and theological implications within Catholic tradition. Father Valdez's documentation would eventually become part of Vatican archives dealing with unexplained supernatural phenomena in the Americas, contributing to church knowledge about the intersection of indigenous spirituality, Catholic practice, and frontier conditions in the developing American territories. Father Valdez's investigation took an unexpected turn when he discovered that the supernatural phenomena extended beyond lie detection to include what appeared to be prophetic warnings about future events. During his third week in San Rafael del Valle, the bells began ringing spontaneously during morning mass, despite the absence of any obvious deception or false statements. The ringing continued for several minutes with a pattern that residents had never heard before, urgent, rhythmic, and deeply disturbing in its implications. Within hours, a messenger arrived with news that justified the bell's warning. Apache raiders were indeed approaching the valley, contrary to recent peaceful periods that had lulled the community into reduced vigilance. The supernatural advance warning allowed residents to prepare defenses and request military assistance, potentially saving lives that would have been lost in a surprise attack. This expansion of the bell's capabilities from past-focused lie detection to future-focused prophecy represented a fundamental change in the nature of the phenomenon, suggesting that whatever intelligence controlled them was growing in power and sophistication. Father Valdez recognized the theological significance of this development. Prophetic ability was considered one of the most sacred gifts in Catholic tradition, reserved for saints and divinely inspired individuals. The possibility that inanimate objects could manifest prophetic powers raised complex questions about the nature of the supernatural forces at work in the desert community. His reports to church authorities described a phenomenon that defied easy categorization, displaying characteristics of both divine blessing and spiritual anomaly that required careful theological consideration and possibly intervention by higher church authorities. The situation was evolving beyond local ecclesiastical jurisdiction into territory that might require Vatican attention. The Apache raid that the Bells had predicted arrived 3 days later, but the advance warning had allowed the community to prepare in ways that transformed what might have been a massacre into a strategic victory for the territorial militia. The raiders found a well-defended settlement with reinforced positions and coordinated resistance that frustrated their attack and forced them to withdraw with minimal gains. However, the successful defense of San Rafael del Valle came at a cost that highlighted the complex moral implications of supernatural intervention in human affairs. During the battle, several decisions required quick judgments about tactics, enemy movements, and casualty reports, situations where absolute honesty could potentially aid enemy intelligence or undermine morale among defenders. The Bells' presence created a crisis of military ethics, as commanders struggled to balance the practical necessities of warfare with the supernatural enforcement of absolute truthfulness. Some defenders found themselves unable to use conventional military deceptions, while others discovered that the supernatural oversight somehow distinguished between lies told to protect innocent lives and those motivated by cowardice or personal interest. Dr. Hartwell's instruments recorded the most intense electromagnetic activity yet observed during the battle, suggesting that the supernatural forces were actively engaged in monitoring and judging human behavior, even in life and death situations. The successful defense established San Rafael del Valle's reputation as a community under divine protection, but it also demonstrated that supernatural intervention in human affairs created moral complexities that conventional religious and ethical frameworks were inadequate to address. Stay with us as we explore how this supernatural protection would ultimately transform into something far more challenging and mysterious. In the aftermath of the Apache raid, Territorial Governor David Meriwether arrived in San Rafael del Valle to personally investigate reports of supernatural military intelligence that had helped defend the frontier settlement. The governor brought with him a delegation that included military advisors, territorial officials, and representatives from Washington who were interested in understanding whether the phenomenon could be replicated or controlled for governmental purposes. The idea of supernatural lie detection and prophetic warning systems had obvious applications for military intelligence, diplomatic negotiations, and law enforcement that could revolutionize territorial administration and frontier defense. However, the government investigation quickly revealed the impossibility of controlling or directing the supernatural forces at work in the community. The Bells responded to their own mysterious criteria and could not be commanded or manipulated to serve human purposes, no matter how noble or necessary those purposes might appear. Governor Meriwether's attempts to test the phenomenon for official use were frustrated by the Bells' apparent ability to detect and resist instrumental exploitation. When government officials tried to use the supernatural oversight to extract information from suspected spies or criminals, the Bells remained silent, apparently refusing to participate in coercive interrogation regardless of the legal or military justification. This resistance to governmental control demonstrated that the supernatural intelligence operating through the Bells maintained its own moral framework that did not necessarily align with human political or military objectives. The realization that the phenomenon could not be weaponized or controlled for official purposes created disappointment among territorial authorities, but also relief among residents who had worried that their community might be transformed into a government experiment in supernatural law enforcement. The winter of 1855-1856 brought new challenges as the isolation of the desert community became more pronounced due to weather conditions and the growing reluctance of outsiders to visit a place where supernatural forces monitored human behavior. The reduced contact with the outside world created a hothouse effect that intensified the psychological and social pressures already generated by the bell's influence. Residents found themselves developing an insular culture that was increasingly different from the broader frontier society, with social norms and expectations that reflected their unique situation under supernatural oversight. Dr. Hartwell, who had remained in the community to continue his scientific observations, documented what he described as the evolution of a new form of human society, one where traditional social lies and polite deceptions were impossible, where absolute honesty was enforced by supernatural sanction, and where community relationships had to be rebuilt on foundations of complete transparency. The winter months provided an opportunity for reflection and adaptation as the community learned to function effectively under their unusual circumstances. Children who had grown up with the bells developed communication styles that were remarkably direct and emotionally sophisticated, having learned to express complex feelings and thoughts without resort to the small deceptions that typically characterize social interaction. Adults gradually developed new forms of politeness and consideration that acknowledged difficult truths while maintaining kindness and community support. Father Santana observed that the enforced honesty, while initially disruptive, was beginning to create deeper levels of trust and intimacy among community members than he had ever witnessed in conventional social settings. As spring returned to the valley, the bells began manifesting new capabilities that suggested their supernatural evolution was continuing to develop in unexpected directions. Father Valdez, who had remained in the community to conduct his extended investigation, documented incidents where the bells appeared to respond not just to spoken lies, but to unspoken intentions and internal deceptions that people practiced on themselves. This expansion into the realm of psychological honesty created even more profound challenges for residents, who found that self-deception and rationalization, normal psychological defense mechanisms, were now subject to supernatural judgment. The bells would ring when people told themselves comfortable lies about their motivations, denied their own feelings, or refused to acknowledge difficult truths about their relationships and behavior. Dr. Hartwell's scientific measurements indicated that this new level of supernatural oversight was accompanied by even more complex electromagnetic phenomena, suggesting that the force controlling the bells was developing the ability to monitor human consciousness at levels that challenged fundamental assumptions about privacy, free will, and the nature of thought itself. Some residents experienced this development as a form of spiritual purification that was helping them achieve unprecedented levels of self-awareness and psychological health. Others found the constant supernatural monitoring of their internal thoughts and feelings to be an unbearable invasion that left them feeling like prisoners in their own minds. The community began to polarize between those who welcomed the deepening supernatural intervention as divine guidance and those who feared they were losing their essential humanity to forces they could not understand or control. The theological crisis created by the bell's expansion into monitoring internal thoughts and feelings prompted Father Valdez to request direct intervention from church authorities at the highest levels. His reports to the Bishop of Santa Fe and eventually to Vatican officials described a phenomenon that had evolved beyond traditional categories of miraculous intervention into something that challenged fundamental Catholic teachings about free will, moral responsibility, and the relationship between divine judgment and human agency. The Church's response was cautious but decisive. A senior investigator would be dispatched. The bells had become more than just instruments of truth in La Esperanza. They had become the town's conscience, its moral compass in an increasingly complex world. Father Miguel watched from his study window as townspeople gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed and careful. The supernatural phenomena had transformed not just how they spoke to each other, but how they thought about truth itself. Children who had grown up with the bell's constant presence possessed an almost uncanny ability to detect deception, their young minds attuned to the subtle vibrations that preceded each supernatural chime. The elderly spoke of dreams where the bells called to them, urging confessions of long-buried secrets. Maria Consuela had documented over 300 instances of the bell's intervention, each case revealing another layer of the mystery that had consumed her life. She noticed patterns emerging from her meticulous records. The bells rang differently for different types of lies, their tone varying with the severity and intention of the deception. Small white lies produced gentle, almost melodic chimes, while malicious falsehoods triggered harsh, discordant clanging that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. The most disturbing discovery was that the bells had begun to ring for lies that hadn't yet been spoken aloud, as if they could detect deceptive thoughts forming in people's minds. This development terrified even the most devout residents, suggesting that the supernatural force behind the phenomenon possessed an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. As winter approached La Esperanza in 1860, the bell's influence had spread beyond the town's borders, drawing visitors from across the southwest who sought to witness the miracle firsthand. Among these pilgrims was Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician and amateur scientist from Boston, whose analytical mind refused to accept supernatural explanations for the phenomenon. He arrived with an array of instruments designed to measure vibrations, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic disturbances, determined to find a rational explanation for the bell's behavior. Morrison spent weeks in La Esperanza, attending masses, interviewing residents, and conducting experiments that often left him more puzzled than when he began. His scientific instruments detected unusual magnetic anomalies around the church, particularly near the bell tower, but nothing that could explain the bell's apparent ability to respond to human deception. The doctor's presence created tension in the community, as many residents viewed his skepticism as a threat to their faith and the miraculous nature of their protective bells. Father Miguel found himself caught between worlds, his deep religious conviction and his growing respect for Morrison's methodical approach to understanding the phenomenon. The priest had begun to wonder if God might work through natural laws that humans simply hadn't discovered yet, rather than through pure supernatural intervention. This internal struggle reflected a broader conflict emerging in 1860s America between traditional faith and the advancing frontiers of scientific knowledge. Dr. Morrison's most significant discovery came during his final week in La Esperanza, when he noticed that the church had been built directly over what appeared to be a natural limestone cave system. Local indigenous people, when carefully questioned, revealed ancient stories about the site being a place where the earth itself could hear lies and punish those who spoke falsely. These legends predated the Spanish colonial period by centuries, suggesting that the location had been considered sacred and dangerous long before the first European settlers arrived. Morrison theorized that the cave system might create unique acoustic properties, possibly amplified by mineral deposits that could respond to subtle changes in human vocal patterns associated with deception. However, his scientific explanation fell short when confronted with instances where the bells rang in response to lies told in complete silence, through gestures or written words that no acoustic phenomenon could detect. The doctor departed La Esperanza with more questions than answers, his detailed journal becoming one of the few contemporary scientific accounts of the phenomenon. His final entry, discovered years later among his papers, contained a grudging admission that some mysteries might exist beyond the current reach of human understanding. Meanwhile, the town continued to adapt to life under the bell's watchful presence, developing new social customs and communication methods that acknowledged their supernatural guardians. Young couples learned to court each other with unprecedented honesty, creating relationships built on foundations of absolute truth that older generations envied and admired. The legacy of La Esperanza's truthful bells extends far beyond the boundaries of that small New Mexican settlement, representing a fascinating intersection of Western horror folklore and historical mystery. Modern paranormal researchers continue to debate whether the phenomenon represented genuine supernatural intervention, an elaborate psychological experiment, or some undiscovered natural law that science has yet to explain. The town itself eventually faded into obscurity, following the completion of the railroad in 1882, which bypassed La Esperanza and drew its population to larger, more commercially viable settlements. However, local Hispanic and indigenous communities preserved the story through oral tradition, passing down detailed accounts of the bells that could detect lies and the profound impact they had on human behavior. Contemporary ghost stories throughout the American Southwest often feature similar themes of supernatural justice and moral accountability, suggesting that the La Esperanza legend influenced regional folklore for generations. Archaeological investigations conducted in the 1960s confirmed Dr. Morrison's theory about the limestone cave system beneath the church site, but failed to locate any physical evidence of the bells themselves or the structure that housed them. Some researchers speculate that the entire phenomenon might have been an elaborate social experiment designed to study human psychology under conditions of enforced honesty. Others argue that the consistent details across multiple independent historical accounts suggest something genuinely extraordinary occurred in that remote New Mexican settlement. The truth, like so many aspects of Western horror and American folklore, remains tantalizingly beyond our grasp, reminding us that the frontier between the known and unknown continues to challenge our understanding of reality itself.